Okay, hi everyone. Nice to meet you all. I'm Davide Menegaldo. I'm co-contributor in Idle DAO, and yeah, right now I'm going to describe my journey in the DAO world. So, just a brief background about myself. I'm in crypto since 2013, and I started with Bitcoin and with a startup focused on charity and Bitcoin, and then since 2020. I moved into the DeFi and DAO ecosystem with Idle Finance. Idle Finance is the oldest yield aggregator and probably one of the oldest DeFi protocol active now, launched in 2019. So it's more than 2 years and a half live. And since the beginning, our aim is to let users maximize the yields while automatically picking the best rates from the market. So the issue that we saw in the early days, but those issues are available also today, is the fact that when you plan to get a yield, so to generate some returns on a specific deposit, there are different protocols, for example, lending protocols doing this. The most famous ones are Compound and Aave. But what is the most profitable one? One day it's possible to have Aave providing the best APY, the next day Compound can provide higher APYs just because the weights are variable. And on top of this, there are some other conditions. For example, those governance, those DAOs sometimes issue governance tokens as incentives, and in this way they boost their rewards. Sometimes they stop the issuing of incentives. So this means that today it's expensive doing this because you have to manually monitor to track the returns and move the funds across those protocols in order to pick always the best returns. So you need time, money, and skills also for the due diligence process. In general, with Idle, it's possible to automatically allocate and reallocate the funds in the best performing protocols, because Idle has developed a dynamic allocation algorithm that automatically reallocates the funds, the underlying funds, in the best market, and that's our way to optimize the yields while still providing the same level of security as those battle-tested markets. So again, we started in 2019, and after 1 year, so in 2020, we launched the governance. So the protocol became fully decentralized with the ownership of the admin keys directly owned by the DAO and token holder itself. We integrated the compound governor alpha model as a consensus model for the governance, and in this way the DAO is since that day the DAO is fully decentralized and able to decide on new allocations, new products, how to integrate a new product, to change the parameters of the actual product. So since that day, the token holders became fully responsible for the not only the development but also the maintenance of the protocol. Because we saw some issues in having a completely fully decentralized world. I mean, the DAO provides a lot of benefits as a new mechanism, but at the same time, the more decentralized you are, the higher is the number of frictions that you get, and you are more efficient. So while preserving the decentralization for the core aspects in terms of key management, at the same time, we bootstrapped in early 2021 a structure that we called leagues. So leagues are a sort of departments that are composed of co-contributors. So we saw that people came into the idle ecosystem and started contributing to the protocol. But at the beginning, it was not possible to also reward them. So with this structure, the league structure, the protocol itself was able to reward the most active contributors. And that's why we started with a test, a pilot case, the first league with 2 people that started handling the operations of the protocol, because there are a lot of efforts in the background to connect with other protocols, to expand the ecosystem, and also to design and develop new products. So starting from the test, we saw that this initiative went pretty good, and we started scaling the process. So after the initial pilot league, we had 2 main leagues that were called the Treasury League, in charge of the DAO architecture, the ecosystem expansion, the tokenomics, and the business side. And on the other side, we also launched a developer league, because we saw that the technical maintenance of the protocol was something for sure very important, and it required skilled people and skilled contributors. So we started also rewarding them. After those 2 leagues, we also launched, well, the community itself organically. So the need to launch a league focused on communication and marketing. So a 3rd league was fully bootstrapped by the community without the help of the previous contributors. And right now we still have those 3 main verticals with people that work specifically on some tasks, and this ensures the protocol that can scale, but at the same time it's able to surf the wave of the innovation and launch also new product. Okay, so about us, a few more words about our story. So we are backed by good number of venture capitals. We have Consensus, but also Green Crypto, Longash, Greenfield Dialectic, and we also foster the on-top integration. So while we started as a B2C application, so the initial focus of the protocol was mainly individuals that on individual basis directly deposited into the idle protocol to benefit from this yield optimization. At the same time, we saw since the beginning that some protocols were interested in integrating idle just to get the optimized yield, and this would have reduced the efforts in integrating individually the underlying products like Compound and Dave, and at the same time they saw also benefits in maintenance and security, because we demonstrated also in the past that if one of those protocols is affected by a potential issue, then we are also able to reallocate the money into the other opportunities. So the protocol on top is still able to receive a seamless revenue stream, while at the same time they take care of the security. So we take care of the security on their behalf. So right now we have as a integration Enzyme, Go, Harvest Finance, AP Wine, and also Wirearn. So we today, Idle is more focused on fostering the relationship with other DAOs, but also with other entities that can be centralized or decentralized. That's why we are also targeting the institutional capital and institutional market. The protocol itself is live on on the Ethereum network, and recently launched also on the Polygon one, just because also from the security assessment perspective, we think that it's not only a matter of security contract risk. Regarding security contract risk, we have in total 6 audits from professional auditing firms, but also regarding the blockchain and the governance risk, we think that Ethereum and Polygon right now are providing sustainable layer to go with some a secure approach. Then last thing to add here is related to the last product that we launched, that is called the perpetual yield tranches. So in Idle, we started with the product that I mentioned before, that is called best yield, while since in December, we launched this new primitive that is called the perpetual yield tranches, and that allows users to access to the same yield source with 2 different risk profiles. So today we see that there are a lot of protocols that are providing even very high yields, but at the same time they carry a lot of dependencies and a lot of potential surface attacks. So while in order to minimize this risk, we split the risk and the revenues into 2 different risk profiles. So with this primitive, we built the senior and the junior profiles that allow users to access to the same yield source. So for example, let's assume to have as a yield source even Idle itself. On the senior side, we allow users to receive an APY, a yield that is lower than the average one. But at the same time, we allow them to be the first in line to get paid back in case of default of any of the underlying protocols. So Idle itself is also linked with Aave and Compound, for example. So if a loss would happen on any of the underlying and dependencies, so Idle itself, Aave and Compound in this case, the senior tranches liquidity providers will receive back the money. On the other side, we allow users on the junior side to maximize the APY, so they receive a sort of leveraged APY, but at the same time, they are the first in line to pay back the potential losses. So they are the first to cover that potential loss. And we see that we launched this in December, and right now we are still in the bootstrap phase. We have something like $25 million worth of TVL on that specific product. And the most interesting product that we launched is the tranches based on Lido. Lido that provides a liquid solution for if we see that with the the upcoming merge in the Ethereum world, we see that demand for more institutional capital, but also for DAO themselves that are interested to generate a passive yield on the ETH deposits. And that's why till today there were no solution in the middle. It was possible to deposit on Aave and Compound, so a very conservative risk profile, but the yield generated there was about 0.2, 0.3% APY, so it's a very, very low APY. On the other side, the staking solution provides something like 4 up to 5% APY, so much higher than this, but there are some drawbacks, some potential dependencies. For example, the Lido protocol itself can be hacked, or even on the validator side, we see that validators can be subject to the risk of losing the keys or the slashing risk. So all in these cases, the senior side is able to provide a sort of built-in coverage mechanism, while still providing maybe 1 or 2% APY. That is still 10 times better than Aave and Compound. That's why we see also the demand for the senior side. While on the junior side, we see more the appetite is for risk-oriented users and DeFi natives that they feel comfortable in leveraging the Lido protocol to get boosted yield. So more or less, this is what I do with in Idle. My role is related to the business and tokenomics, and I'm full-time contributor in the Idle DAO.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Davide. If you have some questions, anyone? Nobody. Okay, let me introduce Daniel Stone. Daniel is a lawyer, a New York lawyer he focused on cryptocurrency litigation. Yes.
Yeah.
And we like to have the sentiment in New York, in USA, on the state of the DAO, on the state of maybe the regulation. I don't know if there is a regulation on that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, I've got so we definitely have some thoughts about the regulations in the US. I want to thank the Blockchain Education Network Italia for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to letting you know kind of how I see the state of DAOs. By way of introduction, I'm an associate at Roche Friedman, leading cryptocurrency law firm in the States. We probably bring more cryptocurrency related lawsuits than any other firm in the States. So we're very plugged into this space. And the way I approach DAOs as a corporate form is from the vantage point of a litigator, which is to say, my primary focus is on when things don't work. When do things break down, and kind of when they break down, where do they break down, who's hurt by their breakdown, that breakdown, and really who's ultimately left holding the bag or damaged by the breakdown. That's the situation in which our phones ring and we're brought in to help. So my framework that I approach thinking about DAOs is less focused with kind of a utopic vision of corporate democracy, and more kind of narrowly focused on where do they break down, what could go wrong. And obviously, like in the space, we've seen a number of DAOs kind of publicly go wrong already. Obviously the most prominent is the DAO hack, leading to the Ethereum hard fork. Recently, there was a Constitution DAO that sought to purchase an original copy of the US Constitution, collected millions of dollars to do so, but was ultimately outbid at the auction. And so the DAO had the problem of trying to figure out what do they do when their kind of organizing principle fails. They can't buy this Constitution. They have millions of people's dollars, and they decided, I think rightly so, to refund the contributions, but with gas fees. A lot of people received a lot less than they put in. And then even more recently, and this is kind of similar to the Constitution DAO, you had the Spice DAO, which was organized to purchase a copy of Jodorowsky's Dune Bible. It's the book Dune, the movie. A movie was being created. There was it ultimately wasn't created. A group was organized to buy a copy of kind of artwork that was going to go into the movie, and they successfully purchased a book that was probably worth about $40,000 for $3 million, because they misunderstood, it seems, what they were purchasing, thought they were buying the copyright to the artwork, not just a physical book. And so now you have this DAO where people wildly overpaid for a physical object, and they kind of split ownership of it. And it's kind of you have a little bit of a breakdown there. The space has some breakdown. Now, that's not to say there isn't an appeal to DAO. As I see it, kind of the best case scenario is when you have a really active group of engaged individuals who are committed to a project, but don't want to necessarily have that a hierarchical structure. Where everyone is willing to kind of roll up their sleeves and do the work, then a DAO really makes sense, and you can distribute responsibility and decision making that way. You know, in a world in which we were all, you know, everyone was crypto native, you could imagine like a group of hobbyists, say, you know, potters or woodworkers who have a high capital hobby. You know, you have to buy a kiln, you have to buy things that are quite expensive. You don't really need one in your home. So you could imagine a DAO being actually quite a good use, an organizing principle for something like that, where you need to contribute capital, you want to share ownership of something, but you don't necessarily want to have one person who controls access or who is making all the purchasing decisions. There, the breakdown is, I think, more that, you know, the crypto native barrier is going to be the problem, but it makes sense there. You know, where DAOs get more complicated, I think, is when they concern larger operations with diffuse investors, some of whom are going to be less interested overall in the day-to-day running of the operation, and where there's, generally speaking, higher amounts of capital. So there's more concern about kind of how it's being spent. They can create a major moral hazard. And I think from my perspective, it bears mentioning that a lot of the concerns that a purely decentralized autonomous organization create, a lot of those have been kind of addressed by existing corporate forms that we have. And so, you know, I think it's important to kind of think about DAOs in the context of, you know, whether or not you're really trying to reinvent the wheel when it already exists. You know, for example, you know, when you have concerns about diffuse investors who are limited engagement in the day-to-day management, you know, that's kind of been resolved by the standard corporate form. You know, it has a lot of protections for disinterested investors. You know, for example, in Delaware, where most corporations in the states are formed, you know, even a non-majority shareholder who is effectively a controlling shareholder owes limited fiduciary duties to the minority shareholders, to the individual shareholders. And so that, you know, I think that maps pretty well on to the blockchain concerns of, you know, a 51% attack. That's effectively the same concern. And, you know, Delaware law has dealt with it and has actually lowered the threshold below 51%. It's, you know, there have been cases with 34% shareholders being found to owe fiduciary duties to the minority shareholders. And so that's, you know, something that has been dealt with already in American corporate law. You know, similarly, LLCs, you know, allow for the parties who are engaged to more actively limit their liability, you know, allow for pass-through treatment, you know, who bears what responsibility for what. You can really do almost anything, you know, many things with an LLC, but you need to be more engaged with the LLC drafting process, because if you don't pay attention when you sign on to an LLC as a member, you will find yourself, you know, we constantly find ourselves representing people who are disappointed in the lack of rights that they secured for themselves when they signed on to an LLC. And, you know, at the kind of the bottom, I would say on the spectrum, the kind of the least limited liability, you have partnerships. You know, there's a lot of flexibility of the use of assets, but a commensurate increase in the liability. So these forms all exist, and we're kind of asking ourselves, where does the DAO fall into these pre-existing forms? And, you know, I'll focus a little bit on the Wyoming statute that was recently enacted. It was enacted last summer in June of 2021 or July of 2021, but was actually amended earlier this month in important and meaningful ways. And, you know, Wyoming is touting it as the first DAO statute, and I think it is the first one that uses the term DAO. But it's important to recognize that Vermont has a statute for blockchain-based LLCs, and that's existed for a number of years. So, you know, the most important part of both of those statutes, I think, is that they basically wrap the DAO in an LLC. You know, they add a little bit of flavor to the blockchain, you know, and kind of incorporate the blockchain into the statute. There are references to the blockchain, not the actual blockchain. But they say, you know, unless inconsistent with with this statute, the LLC Act applies. So what they've really done is said that a DAO in these states is going to be treated like an LLC, basically a creature of contract, what, you know, in this case, smart contracts. And there are a couple other provisions that are worth calling out. I think that the two most interesting parts of the statutes are that the DAO's operating agreement, kind of the governing papers behind it, is allowed to be a smart contract. You know, maybe this is because I'm a lawyer and I'm not a programmer, but it raises a number of concerns for me that I still think need to be addressed. You know, ultimately, you know, the operating agreement of an LLC, the governing papers, you know, are very important in determining the rights and responsibilities of individuals. You know, can the LLC demand that they make additional contributions of capital? Do they owe fiduciary duties? You know, who's responsible for what? You know, is there indemnification? So if you as a member of an LLC is sued, you know, does the LLC have to pay for the cost of defense, or do you? You know, how will disputes amongst the members be resolved? How will disputes between the members and the LLC be resolved? You know, these are hard questions. And while it is conceivably possible to answer them in code, I think what my concern there is you haven't really reduced any transaction costs associated with agreeing to be part of the organization. You've just transferred them from lawyers to programmers. You know, it would be unwise in many situations to become a member of a DAO whose operating agreement is a smart contract if you haven't read the operating agreement. And if that operating agreement is a smart contract, you need to read the code. And so, you know, maybe you're not calling up an attorney to review the operating agreement. Now you're calling up a programmer, but programmers aren't trained to approach their job. You'll kind of have to have a new specialization of programmer consultants who kind of sit in both seats, because programmers often are, you know, by design kind of fail forward fast. You know, they want to solve problems and move on to the next one. And then it's through the kind of discovery of bugs that you get to better and better code. That doesn't work once you've kind of agreed to be part of a DAO. So, you know, you kind of have to front load that. And so, you know, if you've kind of changed just where the transaction costs are in terms of, you know, if you're not fluent in legalese or solidity, it's kind of, you still need somebody to translate for you. And, you know, my view is, at least at this juncture, you're going to find more lawyers who are better at seeing potential problems ex ante, you know, before they come up, than you might find with programmers. And maybe that will change as more and more DAOs come to exist and smart contracts, you know, start becoming deferred to. But at this juncture, that's kind of that's where I come out. You know, and this, the Wyoming statute in particular really highlights this problem, because the Wyoming statute specifically states that if there is a conflict between the articles of incorporation and the smart contract, you know, if you have a written articles of incorporation in English or Italian, and then the smart contract, and there's a disconnect, that the smart contract preempts the articles of incorporation. And that to me seems like a real recipe for, you know, disaster for some individuals. You know, I don't think as an attorney, you're going to have a lot of ground to stand on to say, you know, somebody, my client thought that the articles of incorporation said X and it turned out the smart contract did Y. I mean, here, if the Wyoming statute applies, the Wyoming statute says smart contract controls. And so again, it's more important that you have a programmer who tells you exactly what's going to happen than an attorney. And that raises a couple red flags for me. And so really, ultimately, if I was going, you know, if somebody was thinking about making a large investment in a Wyoming DAO, you know, my recommendation would be you should hire an attorney, and you should hire a programmer, or, you know, to work with the attorney. And now you've actually increased the transaction cost. You have two experts to get you involved as opposed to one. One meaningful change that was made in the March amendments to the Wyoming DAO statute was that they removed the idea of an algorithmically managed DAO. It used to be the statute is originally enacted had member managed DAOs and algorithmically managed DAOs, and they've kind of collapsed the two categories and said that DAOs must be managed by members or smart contracts. The idea of a purely algorithmically managed DAO makes it, very limited sense. I mean, ultimately, a computer can't do anything that it wasn't told to do by people in the first instance. And you kind of, again, as a litigator, you need to know where the buck stops. And if it stops with an algorithm, again, that's a recipe for confusion when somebody gets harmed, which inevitably will happen in this space. I mean, in any space, there's always litigation. So I think that was a really positive change to make it clear that ultimately, there isn't just two different types of DAOs that might allow people to avoid liability. So kind of in sum, what does the Wyoming statute get us? It gets us a wrapped LLC. And my concern with that is that it kind of puts a finger on the scale of the, as I started when I talked about the kind of spectrum of corporate forms, it puts a finger on the scale that DAOs should be LLCs. And as I kind of think, the best thing that could happen in the space is a kind of a more creative approach where DAOs aren't necessarily their own corporate form, but rather a way of managing whatever corporate form you've decided to be, right? And so you could have the corporation integrate the blockchain into its management or cap table, right? Such that the public accounting, that the accounting becomes a little bit more public, or the equity holders are easier to track. And there's no reason, as I see it, why you couldn't use some blockchain components to lower oversight costs while still using the normal corporate form or partnership or LLC. And, as we've already seen, currently the Wyoming DAO statute, if it does anything, it kind of raises a red flag for the SEC that they should be looking at you. Currently, the first attempt to create a Wyoming DAO was a company called American Crypto Fed DAO LLC, and it was basically immediately shut down by the SEC for selling an unregistered security. To just kind of to close, I think the key thing to do is to think about who are you trying to protect and what are you trying to achieve? If you really want to have if you think that your group, everyone is going to be engaged and you want to have fungible membership opportunities, a DAO really does make a lot of sense, but it's worth recognizing that it comes with costs. You have a little bit less, member protection baked in the law. As Davide said, there's a little bit of friction. There can be friction when you need to make a quick decision. In particular, if you really are using a direct democracy approach and you need to get a large number of people on board, it can slow the work down, as opposed to a board of directors, which can get on a Zoom, 10 people get on a Zoom quickly. And you lose some of the protections that are kind of for minority investors, but at the same time, you do get a lot of creativity, and you aren't kind of isolating the people who run an organization in an ivory tower. And we've seen, in this space, one of the best parts of it is that, kind of anybody who has a good idea can generally get some people on board, and those people can get some more people on board. And then you can really see, the direct democracy work quite well. So those are my current thoughts on kind of the state of the DAO, and in particular the Wyoming DAO LLC statute. And I'd be happy to take any questions. But again, thank you for the opportunity to come in and talk about where we see the space.
Thank you, Dan. But one question: the SIC, the approach of the SIC is very strict. In 2070, the first report was on the DAO, and they have changed have they changed this approach or not, or is actually the same strict regulation and the same approach of the cryptocurrency phenomena?
Yeah, it's really the same. The SEC has been really dialed in. I would actually say more so than in 2017. The current SEC chair, Gary Gensler, has been very very kind of aggressive in the crypto space. And there are ways to try to kind of make it clear that what you're dealing with is not a security. You could try to have a lower level of involvement. You could, or lower number of people involved, excuse me. There are some exceptions that might apply if you have a relatively small number of people involved. Some groups try to, or try to make sure that the decentralization is really complete, and that the founders and the original kind of group doesn't maintain control. I think a lot of these, a lot of crypto companies that want to become DAOs, they still the founding company still maintains a reserve and a substantial voting block, such that it's not, and this is what happened with the DAO report. One of the things they said was like, yeah, you've kind of spread governance out, but ultimately it's still the Slockit team is the ones in charge, and the people who the DAO governance tokens are not really going to be running things. You're still expecting to profit from the work of others. And so I think if you really had decentralization, you'd have an argument that didn't apply, but it's really hard to get there, especially on a massive level where you're really, you have millions of tokens in circulation, and they're held in hundreds, if not thousands, of wallets.
Okay, thanks for the answer. And we have Davide. Davide.
I have a question for Daniel. First of all, thank you for your explanation. Very inspiring, your insights about your vision for Wyoming and LLC. And I'd like to know your point of view regarding the benefits, and you already answered this question partially, but just to, in a short answer, to understand your vision in the benefits and drawbacks in getting an incorporated DAO or remaining unincorporated. So today, 99% of the DAOs are still unincorporated. So this means that they are not subject to SIC or whatever is the regulatory entity in any state. Do you still see more barriers to entry and more potential drawbacks than benefits, or and when do you think this scenario will change? So most of the DAOs will try to be incorporated entities instead of remaining unincorporated.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the unincorporated approach, does have appeal for because it kind of makes the decentralized nature of the organization feel a little bit more, I guess, for lack of a better word, authentic, because you don't have a kind of in order to incorporate a DAO of any sort, you have to have somebody who does it, right? And that's, ultimately these unincorporated associations feel that that's what a DAO feels like. It's a group of people getting together for a purpose, and then making it dependent on the blockchain and smart contracts. But there are positives there, especially kind of in the founding group, insofar as it kind of, I think, helps that argument that it's really decentralized. That there isn't some kind of foundation that took the lead at the beginning and is trying now to kind of offload its responsibility. That being said, there are also, I think, costs associated, especially when it comes to litigation and liability. We see cases where on both sides of the case, or kind of on both sides, depending on who's involved, this unincorporated approach creates additional uncertainty. So, if Microsoft is harmed by some kind of somebody's behavior, Microsoft can bring an action on its own behalf, because it's a corporation, and the law recognizes it. If you have a token, but there is no kind of corporate form, you're kind of left with a class action. And it's not, because there's no entity that can stand in the shoes and say, I have been harmed. The best argument is the token holders could say they have been harmed. But there's ambiguity there, and there are, class actions are not, they're not always, they're not always allowed to proceed. And so, that's, that's a pitfall that I think only comes up once you've been harmed. But it's one worth being aware of. The second one is kind of the inverse of that. If you're a token holder and a protocol does something to harm you, and there isn't an entity to which you can kind of seek redress, you likewise you may find yourself in a difficult situation to determine kind of who should you be going after to get what you think is owed to you. And as an issue in the space generally is, not every wrong has a remedy yet. And I think creating corporate forms does kind of enable that. So it's there's still transaction costs associated with it, with creating the correct corporate form, determining what the correct corporate form is. But the default rules are not necessarily, an unincorporated association is kind of leaves anyone who, if it's found to be a partnership, even implied, it does mean that everyone who is a partner has personal liability. And so there's danger there.
Perfect. Thank you for the answer.
Okay, David, I think there's a question. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Giuseppe Morlino in the crypto space since 2018. First as a builder, then as an investor more recently. I have a question for Dan about who is thinking are the most relevant DAOs out there, apart from the couple that you already mentioned. And also one for Davide about the main metrics, if you can share it, for the idle DAO. Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot to the organizer for organizing the meeting.
Yeah, the ones that come to mind, thanks for the question. The ones that, the DAOs I'm kind of paying most attention to see how they work is probably the DeFi DAOs. The Aves, the compounds. I'm paying a lot of attention to those because it's an interest. The DeFi space feels like it is. It should work well for a decentralized organization, but again, I think I've seen. I don't want to say I haven't seen a situation where I'm like thinking this is a controlling shareholder problem situation, where there's a conflict of interest. But even recently, in the compound DAO, A16Z has a large stake of it, and the community was trying to get Matic added to the protocol, and spent months discussing it, and A16Z said no, just kind of voted no, and that was it. And that because they had the votes to it, and that I don't they put out a statement saying why they did it. They said they just didn't think that the security was there and that they want to revisit it, but so I'm not trying to suggest at all like I think there was something untoward there, but it looked to me like a situation where you could see something untoward happening in another world, where they have a stake in a coin that maybe they would otherwise have, and they being any controlling shareholder, if they have a stake in a coin, they want to get it added to a DeFi protocol, and they have the ability to do so. They might do so despite kind of concerns of vulnerability, and it's something that I think we need to kind of see how the market moves on that, and what people come up with to avoid situations like that. Because if you are in a DeFi, in a DAO situation, you haven't kind of and the DAO says there aren't fiduciary duties, then there's going to be limited protection against somebody doing something maybe in their own best interest, but not necessarily in the best interest of the DAO.
Okay, it's my turn. Thanks, Giuseppe, for the question. I mean, Giuseppe, would you like to add something more regarding the Daniel answer?
No, thanks. Thanks a lot, Daniel. Thanks a lot.
Okay, perfect. So thanks, Giuseppe, for your question. Discussing about metrics in the DAOs, in the DAO space, most of the DAOs use the Dune dashboards. So there are Dune dashboards for everything from APYs to cash flow to TVL or whatever. In terms of idle, we have we use those Dune dashboard. In general, it's possible to track, for example, the TVL using public platforms like DeFi Pulse or DeFi Llama is the most used one. But TVL is not the only metric that DAOs should use. So what we see in the space today is the fact that it's possible and it's pretty easy also to boost the TVL with no real tangible benefits for DAOs. So the most clear example probably is a lending protocol with the lending and borrowing section. If the protocol is able to subsidize the borrowing section with incentives that are higher than the borrowing cost, then it's profitable for users. Just deposit and lend, borrow, and continue almost infinitely this process, just because the final user, the liquidity provider, would boost a lot the final APYs with this operation, and at the same time, they create some TVL. So the protocol is also protocol's users are also happy because they see the TVL skyrocketing. This is fine for a bootstrap phase, but at the same time, this is not sustainable, because at the end, this means that you are issuing more tokens that where the dollar value is worth more than the generated fee, for example. So it's not sustainable on the long run. And this is also similar to what is happening with similar mechanism, for example, with Anchor protocol, where they asked for a loan, I don't remember from which foundation, just because there was the risk of running out of money in order to subsidize and sustain very high TPYs. So I would say that TVL is a pretty important metric, but not the only one. I would say that cash flow for protocols and define the long-term sustainability would be the most important metric to analyze.
Thanks a lot for your extensive answer, Davide. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. May I ask you a question as well?
Sorry, I'm on mute. Yes.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I have to raise my hand or there was someone else in the queue.
No, it's okay.
Okay. I do have a bunch of questions. One is from Daniel, one is for Davide. So when it comes to DAO, we think DAOs can be adapted to standard organizations. So the current state of art in normal organizations is that you have different layers, and you also have external contractors and different authorities interacting with the main company. When it comes to DAOs, we can think on a theoretical standpoint that external companies can interact with the main DAOs using smart contracts or other sort of contractualistic. But when it comes to a legal point, and there is some kind of dispute, how you solve it in a trial? You have to address the problem to the main DAO, or you have to relate to the smart contract or all the sort of contractualistic you develop, during the time with external contractors that is interacting with the DAO. So, that is related with what you said before, and LCC and DAOs. So I was trying to figure out how it works with different layers of interaction between DAOs and externals or organization. So that's my first question.
Yeah, I mean, it ultimately is, kind of in some ways not that novel of a problem, because it ultimately, you're not going to have a smart contract come out of the ether, like there will be people who reached out, some person will have been authorized by the DAO, in kind of the best world right now to go and find a contract or some outside party, and they'll generally have to agree on terms outside of a smart contract, I think, before you really get to the smart contract, if it's a major one. And in that situation, you're still going to have kind of the same case that you'd have, you just need programmers to kind of look at what the smart contract is and make sure it is what the parties, can kind of work it into what the parties agreed. If you do have the ability to kind of, you have a DAO and another DAO, and they both kind of have in a contract lawyer sense, kind of an offer outstanding that anyone can come along and accept, and then you kind of have a meeting of the minds kind of digitally.
In the case of DAOs interoperating one with the other is fine, but going deeper in an example, if you try to, in a scenario in which you have to leverage on some unexecuted payments or some problem with the liquidity of the DAO itself, the external companies, how can relate those problems, leveraging on some people that certainly have duties, but they have underneath a MetaMask address, or they are, hidden behind a string of numbers. So they have not exactly an identity behind that you can leverage on. I understand it's an LCC, but still, that could deliver a problem that the DAO needs a lot of treasury in order to find contractors and be solvent towards them.
It's exactly right. I mean, if you're contracting with a DAO, you need to be confident that, when the smart contract you're dealing with, executed, there will be the assets underlying it. And because you have, and especially if you're an unincorporated association, if you are a member of a DAO who's an unincorporated association, and some contractor finds themselves with, a claim against you, that might be a personal claim against you. And like you said, the contractor has the downside of, it's a MetaMask address, good luck. But if they find you, which, we've seen, we see all the time, people, through,
it's possible.
You can find people and once you find them, it kind of often you pull that string and the whole sweater unravels, to use an idiom, which I hope translates well.
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah. And here in Austria, they also have on-chain double checks, and they can check on-chain transactions, so they can find you.
Exactly. And once that happens, you an individual might, as a member of a DAO, might be left holding the bag for the DAO's responsibility if a court looks at the DAO and says this is actually a partnership. Because that's, and that was kind of an answer to Davide's question. That was what I was trying to get at, was that, if a court finds an implied partnership amongst the members of a DAO, which, I think could happen in a lot of cases, the general rule of partnerships is that the partners are personally liable, unless they formed under a limited partnership or an LLC or a corporation. And so I think a lot of people are relying more on the anonymity of cryptocurrency than on the legal protections provided from corporate forms.
Makes sense. Anyway, thanks a lot for the answer, for the wise answer. And if I may ask a question to Davide, or otherwise gonna shut me up. I don't know, any approval maybe?
No, Davide.
Yeah, I think you can go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot. My question is, from a mathematical standpoint, when it comes to tokenomics, the tools available right now in the market to design DAOs and launch DAOs, simple DAOs, the tools are pretty limited. So you can now apply the whole system of tokenomics to the current, Aragon DAOs and things like that. So which are the best way to test tokenomics mathematically wise in advance before launching a DAO? Also from a theoretical standpoint, but just to figure out if the whole thing is working.
That's a very good question with a very difficult answer. From the theoretical point, there are a lot of models, literally a lot of small changes, big changes on the main battle-tested models. In general, at least my personal approach is to check mainly the models that are already live, just because the theoretical approach can provide you a specific scenario while the current scenario is completely different. And we see this in multiple times with DAOs also failing to the launch just because of bad tokenomics. And from the, again, the theoretical perspective, it was perfect, but then maybe the market reacted in a different way, or there were some sideways to overcome to some theories in the tokenomics model. So I think that right now we see that there are, for example, the compound model with compound governor Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie is going to be improved, and this is one specific case. The Aragon one that you mentioned is another potential DAO approach. There are still some drawbacks on that model. It's a bit more centralized, while the compound one is a bit more decentralized. Today, we see from the tokenomics perspective that the curve model is going to be mainstream. The V-tokenomics is called the V-tokenomics, so the voting escrow governance tokens, just because it's possible to align the incentives between voters and liquidity providers. So with Compound itself, with Aragon, token holders are able to vote. And this means that there are some boundaries in the benefits that they can achieve. At the same time, liquidity providers are a completely different class of market. So it's a group composed of players with specific interest to maximize their yield. How to get both at the same time with Curve in launching the Curve model, and then other protocols integrating, developing something on top of Curve. We have Convex that developed a sort of model to shape the votes of the Curve token holders according to their own interests. So this is an on-top application. And then today we are already in the next level. For example, there are platforms called Votium that are used for bribes. And this is a pretty strange, because from the legal perspective, a bribe is not a positive term. But in the DAO ecosystem, this is becoming an industry standard. So someone that pays you to vote for their specific pool because they have interest. So they need to increase their share of the rewards, for example. And you have a question?
Yeah, but DAO-wise, we consider them as a malicious, actors inside the DAO. So if you have to figure out a way to kick them off or reduce the power they can have inside the DAO, the fact that this bribery model is becoming the standard kind of scares me in the moment in which I'm developing a DAO, because I don't really know how to figure out the best way to kick them off or create a disincentive model to make them stay away from this kind of bribery actions.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point of view. At the moment, the market is not seeing this as a negative approach. I mean, a lot of DAOs are moving into the V-tokenomics model just because they see more advantages in a potential hostile takeover or having whales manipulating the market. At the moment, the situation is this one. So having even multiple ways or entities like Convex bribing, accepting bribes, and manipulating Curve. What we saw from the market is the fact that Curve received a lot of benefits from these methods, because today they started from Convex, but today, for example, there are Frax, Redactor to Cartel, other DAOs that are acquiring governance token, not only to vote for their own pools, but also to accept also bribes as a completely new revenue stream. And this is a sort of meta-governance, and the meta-governance concept is pretty interesting because, again, with the compound model, for example, meta-governance is limited to vote for example, the listing of their own token into compound lending platform. So I can acquire some comp token just to increase my votes and let my proposal pass. But after this, I don't have power in receiving more rewards or less rewards. It's just a yes or no. Here with Curve, not only the listing of my token is permissionless in Curve, so I can autonomously create this, but when it's the time to decide how much we're worth, Curve will allocate for that specific pool. I have a say, thanks to my tokens, and other protocols have a say on their own assets again, and there is this mechanism of someone paying someone to vote or accepting bribes. So I see your point regarding that is scared. It's still an evolution. There is not a final answer. It's still, I mean, it's a perpetual work in progress. So according to how the market reacts, it's possible to understand the next step. 1 year ago, the Curve model was something not clear to most of the people, and they were live since many months already. But yeah, they didn't, most of the DeFi ecosystem didn't perfectly understand that model and the benefits.
Probably the best way to figure out the best approach to include those new bribery models inside underneath the tokenomics of the protocol, so you can have a clear control on what's going on, and you can also include it in while you're doing your math and calculate everything. But still, I have to figure out the best way to include them. But maybe we can come up with a solution in the next month, hopefully. So yeah, thanks a lot for the wise answer. Really, it was really interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome, and good luck.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And now we have Scott Moore. He's the co-founder of Gitcoin, yes? So
that's right. Hi, sorry about that. Life in a DAO is mostly on calls. It's mostly about having many calls. So that's been my life today, but I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you. It's your time. You can talk to us about Gitcoin, so we are here to learn.
Awesome. Yeah. Wait, where should I start? What's the best sort of or what questions do folks have about the Gitcoin community, public goods, and DAOs at large?
Hello, Scott. Hello, this is Niccolò from BEN. Well, I mean, I speak for myself, but we have quite no clue about what Gitcoin is and does and public goods. This is an interesting thing to learn because I never heard anything about it. And maybe we would like to know what's your perspective and how does Gitcoin manages actually a DAO and its initiatives? And is it really like many people say, just a Discord group with a bank account, or is there something more? Thank you.
That's a really good, yeah. I think that DAOs are much more than that. And I think that we often have this conflation between the idea of, you know, that is in some sense a DAO, but the idea of these smaller groups that are coming together to maybe crowdfund for an NFT, and then groups that are kind of working together towards a larger common mission. And to me, the latter is more so what I think a DAO ultimately should aim to be in. You can have many of those smaller groups within a larger context, within a DAO, almost, you know, as sub-DAOs or as working groups or as pods, depending on like the context and you know, who you're sort of following, like Orca would, of course, and Julia Rosenberg's work there would be more on the pod side. But the idea of these larger organizations really is, you know, pick a mission, find ways to coordinate around that mission, and largely, you know, think about ways to use tokens or to use tools in Web3 to achieve that mission. And that's really just the high level, like generic sort of view of where we've started on the DAO front. But even before becoming a DAO, what Gitcoin actually is and what we've done has mostly been, you know, around public goods, as you noted. And what we've been trying to do is think through, you know, we started sort of in 2017, 2018, when users in Web3 was like a strange concept. No one really had users for their protocols or their projects. And we started with a bounties product, actually, which was just meant to be a sort of small kind of starting point for the flywheel of funding public goods, funding contributors to open source projects. And we moved on from that to kind of focus in on grants and maintainer funding through quadratic funding, more so in the 2018-19 period. And what we realized through that was, you know, although quadratic funding, which is more of a democratic model for kind of allowing any group to signal their interest in a set of projects, and then accordingly distribute an amount of matching funding from some other larger scale partners, was a really good mechanism, but was also something that was still being controlled honestly by the Gitcoin team and by like a large kind of like entity, traditional corporation, and that wasn't really in line actually even with the democratic principle of having people sort of voting as a community on what they wanted to see funded through quadratic funding. So this idea of, you know, how can we sort of like think about funding contributors, how can we think about funding maintainers, kind of evolved into an understanding of, well, you know, if quadratic funding can democratically fund open source software in Web3, then we should really have the actual management of that democratic tool be managed by Web3 and by the community as well. And so that's kind of how we ended up in this position as a DAO. And the DAO sort of runs in the way I mentioned, which is, I think that, you know, we need to have almost these working groups or sub DAOs or other structures which ensure that there is some degree of like hierarchy or structure. I don't think it needs to be, and I think in fact it should not be the same as a traditional corporation, but it needs to be structured in a way where everyone can kind of like work in squads. Other Internet has a great post on this called Squad Wealth, which I think some folks here might be familiar with. But the idea of squads basically allows you to scale up these kinds of close relationships with peers in a way that allows you to kind of more efficiently achieve a mission. And so what we mean, by the way, by like, you know, public goods funding, which you might have gathered, is like mostly funding open source software, mostly funding Web3 tooling, things like Uniswap here and on the application side, but also things like Ethers.js, you know, Prismatic Labs and Prism and Wallet Connect, those kinds of like more core pieces of infrastructure. And the reason we think this is actually relevant now is that we're kind of moving, you know, the big picture, this is all kind of big picture, but the really big picture is that we're moving beyond the scale of nations and companies to the scale of networks. And that's kind of something that, although, you know, I think I might slightly disagree with this framing that Balaji talks a lot about, and that I think is relatively directionally correct, that we're moving away from corporations and nations to networks. And so, you know, we've been thinking about this sort of DAO as a network of public goods funders. We've been thinking about how we scale that network really fundamentally, and that's kind of been the relatively long story so far. It's hard to condense the sort of like 5 years into 5 minutes, but I think that that's really you know, where we've been aiming, and what we're hoping to achieve is just this sort of civilizational scale of public goods funding, ideally for anything even beyond Web3. So for things like climate change or things like longevity, which are rounds we funded through quadratic funding as well. So I know that's a lot in a short time, but I hope that helps, and I'd love to dive in further, or yeah, like get a sense from folks as to you know, how this might compare with the work that they're doing or their missions.
Okay, thanks, Scott. If there are any questions, no. Okay, thanks Scott for this. No, Davide, maybe
Yeah,
Davide.
if I'm still in time. Hello,
Yeah.
Hi Scott, Davide from Idle DAO. Well, Idle came up from a Gitcoin hackathon in 2019, so good to also see you here. I'd like to better understand what is your vision regarding DAOs, but also DAO governance and meta governance. So just a few minutes ago, we discussed about the curve tokenomics and all of the stuff that is happening behind this. I'd like in general to understand what is your approach to the governance and what are your next plans.
Yeah, and this is a really important point, is that if you have a DAO that is a group chat and multi-sig, Governance is really easy. You just have like 5 people and you decide as a group what you want to do. When you have a DAO of 1,000 people, you run into a few problems, one of which is Dunbar's number. And Dunbar's number is just the idea that like after 150 people, you kind of hit this cognitive limit in terms of people you can really like connect to. And I think that the way around Dunbar's number is mostly through coordination tools. And in democracies in the 20th century and even slightly before, like a democracy was mostly just like, you know, different parliamentary voting systems kind of being tested and kind of like trialed as ways to solve this problem in a more formalized and less sort of social or consensus driven way. But the problem with those models is mostly how you actually ensure the will of the people is managed effectively. And generally speaking, at least in like say the US does a not very good job at this, I would say. And I think that's generally the consensus in even the US about that right now. And the reason for that is that you have like 750,000 people approximately being represented by one person. And so you run into this problem where it's just impossible to really get signal from that large group. And I think that meta governance is a very interesting kind of like, so DAOs run into this problem too. And we have also run into this problem historically in the context of just how we think about essentially how we think about our representatives, our delegates in the DAO and their role in kind of keeping people accountable. And so we did have this problem for a while where accountability was not really present. The representatives were not really active. And therefore, like a lot of things would pass that maybe, you know, in my biased view, were not necessarily like, they were like not negative sum, but they like maybe weren't as impactful as they could be. And I think that, you know, meta governance is an interesting solution to this problem where you create networks of DAOs that are all keeping each other accountable. And I think there's a lot of really interesting work being done by like Prime DAO on this front. I think there's a lot of other organizations too that I can't recall off the top of my head, but I would say that the idea of meta governance and like having organizations effectively act as you know, politicians kind of resolves this problem in a sense. If you have an organization of 50 people that is like really truly dedicated to meta governance of 1 or 2 protocols, you now have at least like, let's say 25 of those people representing, let's say, you know, if this was the US, like 750,000 people. And so you're not doing, you know, the best you could, but you're doing better than 1 to 750,000. You're at least, you know, like doing 25x better. And I think that's something that we will need to see more of as these organizations scale. Now, there's people who might say, well, you know, we don't need that. We should just scale down the DAOs. We should just have many different small little like groups that are localized, and we shouldn't have these large organizations. And I think the problem fundamentally there, I don't think there's a huge problem with it. I'm actually like not totally opposed to that idea. And I think Cosmos and Ethan Buckman have done a really good job of articulating that model. But I think the challenge with it is that you might run into this same problem of scale, but at an institutional level. So if you're trying to manage 300 different DAOs of 5 people, now you have to not only manage the relationships with people themselves, you have to manage the processes. So this kind of happens internally at organizations where, and it's a problem with DAO tooling right now, which is maybe a whole separate topic, but like you have like 20 different tools. People are like, let's try out all these different tools. And now suddenly you have your group of contributors split across 20 different tools, all trying to figure out like what the different like functions are on each one. And that's a problem in the same way with all these small DAOs, because each DAO has their own process and their own norms and their own operating models. And so I do think that there is a need for sub-DAO models. There's a need for pod models, as Orca would say. And that is the solution to that problem, at least in the short term. Maybe there'll be some DAO tooling that eventually gets us to that civilizational scale where we can just straight up have like 500 groups of like, you know, 20 people each all coordinating really effectively. But I don't know that we'll get there. So anyway, meta governance is important. Big fan. And I think it helps solve some of these fundamental problems.
Yeah, thanks for this answer. Very inspiring. I agree with your vision. I mean, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, but at the same time, we are living in an ecosystem that is completely different from the current traditional space. So the beauty here of the DAO ecosystem is the fact that anyone can jump into the ecosystem, start contributing, and then become a co-contributor just because, let's say, hired by the DAO itself, or it can work on a standalone project, and the DAO itself can foster and incentivize these projects. So this is the beauty of the DAO ecosystem that can scale even faster than the traditional model, because the hiring process is different. You don't have to pick people from outside, but people from outside come into your ecosystem, and then that's the spark to get in contact with them and build a relationship. So yeah, thanks for this, for your vision.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. If there any other question or no? If not, we can introduce Mr. Travia. So Niccolò, it's your time.
I think maybe Massimo Chiriatti would like to intervene a few minutes. I'm not sure. If not, I can.
He's after you.
Ah, okay. Okay, so thank you, Massimiliano. I am a lawyer, co-founder of BEN, and I'm skeptic. I can tell you, I'm really skeptic about DAOs. So I organized this meeting to understand this meetup, to understand more, to dive in and try to understand what is the logic, because I see two main problems here, especially in what Scott was saying. I think that we know that Web3 is all about contributing, and so this is I'm totally in line with this. So we change. There's a paradigm shift. Users are not only living in a world that is modeled by big corporations, but they really want to be active in their space, and that's why they get identified with their wallets, because they can easily be paid for their contribution, for their interaction, for whatever they do. And this is fascinating, and it's the way I think in which the metaverse is going, and which Web3 in general, and it's beautiful. But applying this, and also there's another important thing, that is skepticism. Skepticism about the governing bodies, skepticism about every type of vertical interaction. And so maybe the users of Web3 feel that they should be more part of the decision-making process. And that is why I think what DAOs are trying to solve is a shift, they're trying to offer a shift from a vertical type of structure to a horizontal type of structure. But I don't understand the point. I mean, the convenience of using a DAO, except for the organizational aspect. And this is fantastic. I mean, you can manage different groups using sub-DAOs and everything. So you can have a group of people that votes on a single aspect, and maybe you can have a joint decision that is not made by a governance body that is only elected by the people that should be administered from this organization, but there's more contribution. I think this is cumbersome in such a way. That is why in ages humanity shifted to a representative type of organization. But nonetheless, I understand that there is an interest in saying in speaking up if you are contributing to a project or to something. From a lawyer's perspective, I see that DAOs are mainly composed of two elements. So one thing is how to jointly manage a pool of money. And so this is, let's set up some rules that can be semi-automatic to make more transparent and efficient the way the money inside a community is handled. totally fine. I understand this. This can have a convenience. The other aspect is, let's tokenize the shares in the company or in the management of the pool of money, so that people can hop in and hop out easily. And so this maybe the sum of these two elements is what, in my view, constitutes the interesting part, the novel part of the DAO. What I don't understand is, why do that? Why start thinking about it as a corporation? Corporations solve other types of problems. Corporations are thought of to limit liability of people, and that is why we have a governance model, because the people who are the stakeholders or the shareholders, I'm sorry, don't actively manage the company, so they won't be held liable. This is the whole point in corporate law. That is why I don't understand why should a DAO be seen as a corporation. It's useless. It's totally insane to think about people who are on the same level and have a joint liability in a pool of money, and everyone is liable. That is the point. That is the situation from which humanity went out of thinking about corporate law. This is my first skepticism. The second skepticism is, I don't think there's the need to have a statute or to have anything, because at least in Italian law, and I read about some legal doctrine about it, that is very aware of the problem. It can already be done. I mean, the Delaware statute, it was from 2018, I think, spring of 2018. They already said, okay, you can have a corporation, and the book of the shareholders can be held in the DLT format. This solves all of the problems. So you can just make the share, you can transfer the share, just adjourning the book of the shareholders in a way that every transfer is automatically inserted in the book. But this is an organization, a type of organization of a corporation. So the DAO is not the corporation, but the DAO model is used to manage some aspects of a corporation. I think this is what Daniel Stone was his argument, as he mentioned before. But another thing that maybe in perspective could be the usefulness of a DAO is this scenario that I envisage. In a metaverse, like a fantastic name, I don't know, maybe in Decentraland or Sandbox or Meta or whatever it will be, I see that people that are having experiences among each other. What this doesn't happen in Web 2.0. I mean, you have interactions like or hearts and things like that, but you're not physically, you don't feel like there are people with you watching at something, at an advertisement or a concert or whatever. I think DAOs could be interesting in the sense that maybe there's a concert in Fortnite and there's an artist that makes an NFT drop. 5 peers that are looking at the concert constitute a DAO in 1 second, and they jointly acquire the NFT. So they already have a model to manage this pool of money that is represented before by cryptocurrency that they have poured in the pool, and then by the 1 or 2 or 3 NFTs, so they can decide how to use it. So it seems like, I don't know, a quicker way to manage the check at the restaurant when there's a large group of people. Okay, so how we split it up, or maybe how we decide what property rights or other type of rights we can exercise together. And this makes sense to me, but it's not, I can't see it applying right now. The only way I can see DAOs applying right now is as an organizational model of a corporation, or else I think it's very limited, the effectiveness of the DAO. Prove me wrong.
I think those are great points. For the first point, I think especially I agree with you fully, actually. I think that corporations are like the wrong model for how we think about DAOs. But I do think there's lots of, like, I think the fundamental point is that, you know, we sort of assign the idea of anything with hierarchy or anything with like structure to the idea of a corporate model. Like we assume, oh, this is hierarchical, therefore it's kind of like either, you know, we kind of model ourselves, or model a lot of these things based on practices from like different countries or different companies. But there's lots of other models. There's lots of other ways to do these things. And most of them, I think, have just been underexplored or kind of like pushed off to the side. One of which is cooperatives, obviously. And I think cooperatives are kind of like starting to resurge as like an area of interest in the context of DAOs. Austin Roby has written a lot about this. Yancey Strickler, Nathan Schneider, like those are all folks that I think have started to do a lot of work on what does a DAO as a co-op look like and mean. And I suspect that a lot of the interest from Web2 companies will come from companies that are effectively exiting to community in the sense of a cooperative versus trying to kind of like replicate their corporate model on chain. And I think it can be true that you are cooperative, but still have like some of these structures, like a sub-DAO structure in which people still are focused on certain areas of the cooperative, and they simply, you know, are kind of like voting members, but also like workers in that capacity. I think the other model is more on the Ostrom side of a commons, and a commons is kind of, I think, also in general an underexplored concept. I actually suspect that like a lot of the conversation around public goods could be reframed in the context of a global commons, and that would be perhaps like helping in disambiguating the overall notion of what we mean by the public. And this is the fundamental crux of like Toby Shoren's piece on like positive sum worlds. It's like, well, what is a public that Web3 serves and so forth. But a commons is just a collective, often local group, to be fair, that's managing a common pool resource. So like something that is, you know, not necessarily excludable, but it's rivalrous. So something that is like fish or forestry, often natural resources. And Ostrom showed that you can actually have these as sustainable kind of like pools if you create nested structures of organization in the context of that local group. And basically the distinction between a cooperative and a commons is mostly that the commons may actually have like a little bit less structure, less focus on member ownership, and a bit more focus on like kind of soft consensus driven rules for operating in that environment. Now, the benefit of both of these is that they do allow for this, like the sub-DAO model maps them pretty nicely still, because you allow for these organizations to effectively nest into each other. And in fact, that's one of the principles Ostrom provides, is that you should think about, like in the context of having to deal with external authority, how you effectively nest structures so that like there's layers of external authority. But I don't think that these are the same models it's a lot to dive into here, but when you look like deeply into them as like say a representative democracy model or as a corporate model. And I think there are some similarities, but I think that it would be, we are making the mistake of focusing too much on the corporate model, I would agree. To your second point, I think that, yeah, a lot of this is really early. A lot of the tooling's early, a lot of the ways in which we're using DAOs is really early. And I think that there's a need for us to more carefully consider also how we use DAOs. I think there's a lot of people that are just like, I'm going to start a DAO, which means that I spun up a Gnosis safe, and means that like I am going to like go to dinner with my friends and decide on who, like that's like, to your point, like there's a lot of these models that I don't think are like really truly, there is no such thing in my mind as like a true DAO, but there's like, I think a lack of thought being put into the structure and being put into like the way in which they operate and what they're for. But I do think that there is room for that tooling to expand, and there's room for that tooling to really simplify, honestly, just like even in the restaurant example, the process of how people interact in these kinds of cases, like beyond, you know, like the idea of splitting your card at like a restaurant, or like having physical cash and having to like all like pool in money, versus just having like a kind of wallet which you've all pooled money into and then are like drawing one transaction from. In theory, like it's almost, there's some like obvious connection to me between like that is like in the US a better version of Venmo, basically. It's a better version of like, I'm going to get you back. It's just we've already pooled their money into this thing. It is already usable for this particular purpose. We already had this agreed upon like set of rules and like mission towards it. And then like it should be as easy as just like auto execute like this function basically like when this event occurs. Like it should be that easy. But in practice right now it isn't at all. And so I think that like it's just we're early, but a lot of these things over time will become it will become obvious that like even in the case of the restaurant example that like some kind of model of DAO tooling may in fact be effective there. But yeah, Daniel, I saw you went off video on your side.
Yeah, my
or on video, sorry.
Yeah, you know, I agree that like the corporate form and DAOs are not necessarily synonymous. That the concern, and I think this wraps back to what Niccolò was saying, is that, you know, when you have tokens, you know, governance tokens that, you know, you have circulating supplies in the millions, such that, you know, you're always going to have so many individuals. And, you know, as you mentioned, you know, there's a kind of upper limit of involvement at, you know, around 150 maybe. You know, you ultimately end up in a situation where there's just necessarily going to be people who have some ownership, and that ownership is represented in a fungible token that can be traded for money. And for a large number of those tokens, you know, unless the large supply is not representative of a large number of wallets, where there's going to be a large number of people who are, for lack of a better word, just passive investors in the DAO itself. And then, you know, the question is, you know, who, you know, what's their responsibility to the DAO? What's the DAO's responsibility to them? And what, you know, what's their responsibility to third parties? And the concern I have is if you don't kind of come to an agreement there, you know, that could come to bite these passive investors who may expect some protection just because of the kind of the ubiquity of the corporate form in you know, kind of similar situations.
I'd like to add also my vision on this. I mean, right now you all shared very interesting points, mainly regarding the relationship between the DAO as an entity, the token holders, the regulation entity, the core contributors. But to really understand why a DAO is needed today, we need to enter into the mind of a Solidity developer. Because since 2020, well, I would say since a couple of years ago, developers were, and today are also scared about being the single point of failure while managing the admin keys. Because especially if we think about a DeFi protocol, so while this idea would not work for groups that are incorporated into a DAO or whatever, if we just think about DeFi protocols, when there is a protocol, there are smart contracts. When there are smart contracts, there are admin keys. In this case, if there is a single person managing this is a single point of failure. Even if we have a couple of people managing this, it could be a multi-signature with 2 signatures out of 5, 10 out of 50, 100 out of 1,000. Of course, it's not possible to manage a multi-signature wallet with 1,000 signatures because it's very expensive and very inefficient. But at the same time, there is still a centralization point. Just because if few people would prefer to go to Hawaii, they can do this together. With the DAO, it's the first time in the whole history where you have to control the whole network to manipulate the protocol. So this is something very powerful because today, when you deposit the money into whatever is the entity, you are just scared that some people, especially, I mean, when you deposit money into a centralized protocol in the crypto space, you are afraid that that the people behind this can scam you, rob you, and they go away. With a protocol owning the keys, with a DAO owning the keys, this is a completely different perspective. And in general, it increases not only the trust and the reputation, but the vectors to attack the whole level is much more expensive than just bribing a few people. This is, in my opinion, the main point why we need DAO today.
Okay, thanks. If there are any questions, no. Yeah, okay. We are going to the end of this meetup. I call Massimo. I see Massimo for the last few consideration on DAOs. Thank you, Massimo, and thank you. It's your time. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. I hope that you can see my slide. Okay, for you. Massimiliano, can you see my slide? Okay, thank you. Just a few minutes, and thank you again for inviting me. I would like to share with you in a few minutes what I think about trust. Because of course, you know, when you talk about blockchain, you talk about trust. And the trust always carries a risk. In the digital world, even more. For example, for every response that we receive from the person, we must make an act of trust, which always corresponds a risk. Let's see what causes may be. In terms of the philosophy, the space and time. The space increase between people because we are online, but at home. And the times are decreasing. I mean, we have little time to know each other and to trust each other. Entering blockchain, okay. How does blockchain affect hierarchies? And as globalization grows, we need to exchange goods and information between people even more far and faster. The blockchain makes coordination more valuable, and so larger market is allowed and facilitated. In my opinion, thanks to blockchain, we have a recognition of individual rights through collective decisions. It's a it's a sort of new balance that we have found between individual ownership and the social consensus that we reach to affirm that ownership. What about smart contracts? Everything is ex ante here. There is no whole human desire to procrastinate, seeing you later, to the ex post, as my friends, my lawyers said very, very often. And it shifts the confidence from two domains. And in these books I wrote some times ago, I spoke about this social trust. What I mean when I think about computational trust. Before machine, we have a peer-to-peer trust between people. And this domain was philosophy, political, economics. We are talking about social sciences. But when we put between us a machine think about artificial intelligence or a blockchain with a smart contract. There is no direct interaction between humans. I don't know if you agree or not, but in my opinion, we are changing the domain from art to science, from probabilistic between humans to deterministic with machine. And we have to talk about mathematics, physics, and so on, informatics, and so on. For the first time, something, the machine, gives someone the trust. Trust is more in something than in someone. We are moving from object as subjects. And this is, in my opinion, is a very, very complex and very interesting, because a sort of human secularization has begun. In the future, what matters are not answers produced by smart contract or machine in general, but the questions that only we can do, because we have intelligence, we have consciousness. Machine there is no conscience and intelligence in the machine. This is just to thank you for your time, because we have running out of time, and thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, Massimo. Thank you for these considerations. I think that we finished our meeting. I think if someone has some questions or other consideration on DAO, if not, we can go to eat something or to drink something. Okay, thank you to all. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun.
For Dan, thank you. Thank you, Niccolò. Thank you, Massimo. Thank you, Davide. And thank you for all the people that stayed with us.
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to add that the video of this event is available on YouTube, on our channel. Definitely Ben's channel, probably also Legal Hackers channel. And we would try to keep these appointments monthly. If any one of the participants wants to bring up a new argument, a new topic for a new meetup, just feel free. We're more than happy to have these small chats. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.